Now Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.
The first loss. A tremendous victory. Leonard fighting off the ropes.
It happened. It happened. Uppercut by Douglas. Down goes Tyson.
Thompson, right hand shot.
Excellent. Knocks out by Tyson.
Slumps to the canvas.
The champion struggles to stay on his feet.
How do you like it? How do you like it?
Welcome, fight fans, to another episode of BTR Boxing Podcast with your host Sean Bastow, joined by Johnston Brown for this new episode of Legendary Nights, as voted for by you, the listeners and followers on Twitter on the poll, and you voted for Nigel Benn versus Gerald McClellan from 1995. But before we get into the episode, please go and find us on social media, on Twitter at BTR Boxing Pod. Give us a follow on there, check out all our latest episodes. If you don't really use Twitter, if you're a Facebook user instead, we are on there too. BTR Boxing Podcast, give us a search, like the page, see all the content coming out every single week. So, really excited for this one. It is going to be a very interesting conversation because this was one of the greatest fights I'd ever witnessed growing up as a child, but it was also such a sad ending for Gerald McClellan, and we're going to be touching on some very sensitive points throughout the podcast, and I'm really excited to give it justice, to talk about the way this fight went down, to talk about the seriousness of the aftermath of the fight. So, let's get into it then. This is the tale of Nigel Benn versus Gerald McClellan. What a fight we've got on our hands here, Johnston. This is a legendary night in one way and a sad night in another way, but I do believe it's a fight that should be covered off just for the sheer veracity, the sheer pugilism of this particular fight was unbelievable, but also marred by the sad aftermath of obviously what happened to Gerald McClellan. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to actually breaking down the build-up and the fight, and obviously touching on the aftermath and touching about the dangers of boxing and the sport and how it can affect people's lives.
Yeah, completely. I mean, it was literally from ecstasy to agony for Ben. It basically was a bit of a roller coaster in there. The fight itself, it is a fantastic fight. It rightly deserves to be called a legendary night for me. Obviously, with the tragic events that happened after, that's something that obviously we're going to touch on, but a great fight. It really was an excellent fight between two fighters that, they were probably two of the best pound-for-pound fighters around 1995.
I agree, yeah, 100%, and I think that's where we'll go into the usual breakdown of what we do for Legendary Night. So, as always, we will cover off both of the careers and the lead up for this particular fight. We'll talk about the build up to the fight, we'll talk about the fight breakdown, and then obviously this is probably going to be one of the most difficult ones we've done in terms of aftermath because of how sad and how sensitive of a subject it is, but I do believe it's one that we will give justice to, and I think it's good to sort of highlight situations like this because even in this day and age, these things, as we've seen recently, do still happen. So I think it's good to make sure that is still brought to the forefront of people's minds. And whilst we might sit there and call it a legendary night, and people may disagree in terms of because of the aftermath, you shouldn't really be labelling it as a legendary night. I do disagree with people on that because I do think the fight itself, purely on the fight itself, is a legendary night. It was voted one of the best fights of the year. It was voted one of the best fights of the 90s. So for me, you've got to look at it from that perspective, and we'll start off by going into the careers of both fighters, and I think we should start with McClellan first because McClellan's career up until this point had been a real great build-up to this super middleweight title fight with Nigel Benn. Now we look back on his career, and I think when he came to the forefront of people's minds in the early 90s was really when he'd done his apprenticeship in boxing. So he'd had his sort of first 15-16 fights, and then when he got his first major fight for a world title was for the vacant WBO middleweight title. And that's what people may not remember, is that actually Gerald McClellan was a middleweight. He wasn't naturally a super middleweight. He did eventually move up to obviously fight Nigel Benn for the WBC title, but originally he was a middleweight, and that's where he applied his trade at. And his first major fight was in 1991 in November against John the Beast Mugabe, a guy that's appeared on the podcast before when we talked about the Marvin Hagler Sugar Ray Leonard fight. So Mugabe, in his own right, still at this point in 1991, was still a beast. And this fight was, to my surprise, looking back on the history of it, it actually took place at the Royal Albert Hall.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that at the time, to be honest. It wasn't until I sort of watched back on Gerald McClellan's career that I realised, seeing John Mugabe on there, I thought, well, I've got to watch that one. John Mugabe was a tough nut to crack, very strong. I mean, he went all 15. Was it all 15 all the time? I think it was all 15, wasn't it, with Hagler? In a great fight, a really, really good fight. And he got rid of him in a round. It was on the Frank Bruno and John Emmon undercard. I don't know the guy, to be honest, Bruno's opponent there. I'm guessing it was a bit of a layout for him, but because he got rid of him quite early. But yeah, it was on the undercard Royal Albert Hall, and he absolutely destroyed John Mugabe. He knocked him down twice before eventually finishing him off, and the referee waved it off when he finally knocked him down for the third time. But wow, he looked impressive in that fight, and I think from that point, those that were involved in and around boxing in 1991 realised that actually, Gerald McClellan, he's a fighter here, and he's one to look out for.
He certainly is, because this is where he starts to go on this tremendous run of early knockouts. He then goes into 1992 after the John Mugabe win, and he has 3 fights in 1992. Lester Yarborough, Carl Sullivan and Steve Harvey, and knocks every single one of them guys out, and carries on his career in the middleweight division, and then moves on to Tyrone Moore in 1993. And I think then that's where we get another significant fight in his career. The first of 2 meetings with Julian Jackson, who people will remember as being one of the biggest punchers ever in boxing in all weight categories, and a guy that nearly got beat off Harold Graham until he landed an absolutely fantastic peach of a punch which stopped Harold Graham and knocked him out cold. Julian the Hawk Jackson, fantastic fighter in his own right. 46-1 when McClellan got in the ring with him, and it was an expected bout for going the distance. I think people felt this was going to be more of a distance fight at the time, and actually they were wrong, because this fight was always going to be an early night for one of these men, because these men had power in both hands. They'd had great records, knockout ratio records. I think Gerald McClellan's record to that point, he's just 4 or 5, I think it was 4 or 5 or maybe even 6 stoppages in a row. That was an amazing run into this fight. And even, looking at Julian Jackson's career, out of the 6 fights prior to the fight with Gerald McClellan, he'd knocked 5 of them out. It was only one in 1992 against Thomas Tate where it was a unanimous decision victory, but the rest of them, again, were stoppages. So, although there were people at the time that felt, this is probably going to be a points fight, they're going to cancel each other out, I think most people, if I'm being totally honest, looking back, they knew they were going to be a knockout in this because of how big a punches they both were.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you mentioned Julian Jackson 46-1. His only loss came to Mike McCallum as well, and that was a second round TKO. So, he came up against Mike McCallum, who was also a big puncher as well. So obviously, 2 big punchers met, and one of them got blazed out. And that was basically, as you say, I mean, people were tipping it for a long haul, but in actual fact, it was probably inevitable this was going to end fairly soon. It was a great fight. It is actually one I think ESPN put out every now and then on their nights, because it was a fight on one of their broadcasts. It was a great opening round. In particular, the opening round was brilliant, and then I think McClellan got put down with a low blow from Jackson, and it sort of pissed him off because he come back and literally just blazed Jackson down. and then before we knew it, it was a quite evenish fight. I thought McClellan was always, he just waited. It was inevitable. I mean, you could imagine being a viewer watching in '93. I mean, I didn't see the fight, but sort of watching back, you just expect him eventually to land something or Jackson, and then obviously it was Jackson that ended up on the deck, and the referee waved it off. But and a good fight, and I'd advise anyone that hasn't seen this fight to go and have a watch, because it is a good scrap for 5 rounds.
Well, there's something also that I wanted to touch on with McClellan's career before we move on a little bit more in the build-up to the fight with Ben. The bill that he was on in 1993 when he fought Tyrone Moore, if you go back and look at that bill was amazing. That bill consisted of terrible Terry Norris against Maurice Blocker, Julio Cesar Chavez, who was 84-0 at the time, against Greg Horgan, and then we had Azuma Nelson, and we had Michael Nunn, we had obviously Gerald McClellan, Felix Trinidad, and Jose Badillo, all names in their own right, all went on to do something in the sport, and that was an amazing bill. It was a great find, looking back. Obviously, I was only young myself at the time. I was only about 8 or 9 at the time, so I wasn't really that well versed, obviously, in boxing at this point in my life, but looking back on that bill, God, wouldn't you kill to have a bill like that today?
Oh, unbelievable. Who promoted that fight, Sean? I don't even know.
Our good old friend, Mr. Slippery himself, Don King.
Had to be, didn't it? Of course it was. Great card, though. You can't knock him for that. Wow.
And it was in the Azteca, Mexico City as well. It was
Mexico.
Yeah, great bill, fantastic bill. And we look at some of the crap that we get fed in this day and age. That is a bill. That's what you call a bill. That wasn't even prospect versus journeyman as well. That was a fantastic bill. So going back onto point, then let's go back to the McClellan career after the Julian Jackson win. He then went on to beat Jay Bell, stopped him to retain the WBC title that he'd won fighting Julian Jackson. And then we have the fight with Gilbert Baptiste at the MGM, beats Baptiste. And then the final fight before the Nigel Benn fight, before he moved up to super middleweight for the first time in his career, was a rematch with Julian Jackson. So the second time, what did you make of the second Julian Jackson fight?
It was again. I mean, it ended a lot sooner, didn't it? I think Gerald McClellan thought, I'm going to get rid of him early, and that's exactly what he did. It was very ruthless from him. He jumped on Jackson literally from that first second. And he literally destroyed him. And Jackson, obviously, he came after the post-fight interview, he did say that he felt that he could have carried on. If he had have carried on, the referee decided to let that go, I think it would have ended in the second anyway, to be fair. But it was a brutal finish. I think one thing, sort of looking back on sort of the last few fights before Ben, was the fact that Gilbert Baptiste was a last-minute replacement. So he was expected to just blaze this guy out. I think he was 28-16. So Gilbert Baptiste wasn't going to be anyone in particular. I think he took the fight literally on a week's notice or something. But one thing you do notice if you watch that fight back is there's obviously no Emmanuel Stewart in the corner, and there is actually the commentators mention it. And there was talk of a rift, a strategic rift in terms of McClellan not agreeing with what Emmanuel Stewart's giving him and the information he's giving him. But Emmanuel Stewart's actually interviewed after, and he sort of says, although I wasn't there, it was against Baptiste's late replacement. I let the guys who had already been working with him continue their work, so that's why I wasn't around much. I think he had just signed Hearns, back with Hearns again, so he was busy doing that, so he was quite happy to let that go. But it was actually the post-fight interview, which was quite telling, because McClellan was in the ring and he didn't squash that rumour. He basically he was just saying that he will talk to Stewart after, sort of thing. It weren't great, and you could see there was obviously a rift there. And then obviously the Julian Jackson fight, when it eventually come out the second one, when he was in that ruthless streak on the Chavez-Randall 2 bill, by the way, and he destroyed Jackson. And obviously then we knew Stewart wasn't in the corner, and they had departed. He had left because McClellan decided he wanted to manage himself. So, it wasn't ideal going into the Ben fight. Maybe he's listening to too many dodgy people around him in his ear, because, who in their right mind would want to get rid of Emmanuel Stewart?
Well, this is it, isn't it? This is like the whole hindsight is a wonderful thing situation, because obviously the late, great Emmanuel Stewart, even then, was regarded as one of the great trainers of the sport. So why would you want to get rid of him? And Emmanuel Stewart, before his passing, and when talking about Gerald McClellan, did say, like, Gerald McClellan was one of these guys that, he would tell you what to do, or he was the guy that would try and tell you what to do, and if he didn't like something, he wouldn't do it. And we sort of echo back to when we did the Legendary Nights with Tyson and Douglas, where Tyson got into that sort of mentality of the same thing, where he was kind of saying, no, I'm not doing this, I ain't going out for a run, I'm going to do what I want. And you start to think that maybe that was what the mentality of the G-Man was at the time. McClellan was the big shot superstar. He was knocking everybody out for fun. Obviously, as we go on to the fight, he was the favourite. He was the guy, even though he was moving up to fight at super middleweight for the first time against Nigel Benn, he was the guy that was going to come over to the UK and absolutely obliterate Benn and carry on his career at super middleweight. And their hope in their mind was for him to be a megastar, to be an absolute megastar, and he was well on his way to doing that before he bumped into Nigel Benn. So let's move on to Nigel Benn then. Let's talk about Nigel Benn's career, because this is the second appearance on the Legendary Nights series for Nigel Benn. We've covered off the first Eubank fight, but now we're going to move on and we're going to talk about his career post the original Eubank fight and sort of leading up to the second one, and after that, what sort of got him into the position to fight against Gerald McClellan, and how that fight sort of came about. So, we had him obviously winning, going on to be the WBC champion by beating Mauro Galvano in 1992. He went over to Galvano's backyard and beat him, and that was a fantastic win. He became the WBC champion, and you got to remember as well, this was his second world title, but it was at a different weight.
Yeah, he had moved up to super middleweight following that Eubank defeat. He decided, obviously, I think he even went off to America, if I remember rightly, and he just tried to tune himself in and get himself ready. He obviously had a couple of defeats on his record by that time, but a great performance again. It was He did rely on the one-punch knockout power, but, it became a bit more efficient and effective and a bit more of an adaptable fighter, in fact, in terms of when you watch the Galvano fight. Just wasn't so rushed. I think with Watson, when we had his first defeat, he was rushing and he ended up blowing himself out. He blew a gasket and Watson got rid of him. And in the Eubank fight, which we've touched on, was a great fight. But I think Ben decided he needed to just adjust, and he did that. And I think he improved as a fighter. I mean, he wasn't the greatest technically. I've always felt that with Ben, but you can't. He had the fundamentals there, but his just heart and desire was just incredible. And not many fighters around then, or even today, or even past, could really match that. Really, that just heart and desire from Ben, it was just made him such a fan favourite. But a great performance over in Italy.
Yeah, you're right. And then obviously he goes on to beat Nicky Piper, who went on to become a Sky pundit. Obviously Nicky Piper, as we know, if you look at the career of Nicky Piper, people used to look at him and go, bloody hell, he's just a choir boy, this guy. And I remember people used to say that about him when they watch him on Sky. You wouldn't have expected this guy to have been in the ring and obviously fought for world titles before, but actually he did. He went on. He fought and won the Commonwealth light heavyweight title. He went in for the WBO light heavyweight title, and he had his fair share of fights himself. So Nigel Benn beats Nicky Piper, then moves on for a rematch against Galvano, beats Galvano on points, and then goes in there against Lou Gent in 1993, and that's on the card, which also featured Steve Collins and Robbie Reagan, some great names on that particular card. And that was promoted by Mr. Barry Hearn, father of Eddie, Matchroom Boxing. That was a Matchroom Boxing promoted card in 93. And then we get another legendary night, one that's not come up yet, which is the rematch with Chris Eubank at Old Trafford. One of the best fights in terms of the whole build-up and the atmosphere. Not so much as good as the first fight, as we've alluded to previously on that first Ben Eubank episode. We did say the first fight was better than the second one, and we both agreed agreed on that, but he did fight him again. He fought him at Old Trafford. The WBC and Eubank's WBO title was on the line, and it ended up being a split decision draw, which was obviously very disappointing for the droves of fans that came out to watch this fight. And I do have vague memories of the build up for this, the whole what Manchester was like at the time. Manchester was absolutely buzzing for this particular fight, and strangely enough it wasn't really a big card either. There was only 4 of the fights on this card.
Yeah, it was all about the main event, wasn't it? The contest was named Judgment Day. I remember, Sean, as well. I remember the build up to this one, and just all the hype around it. I mean, a record 500 million people actually witnessed his fight, whether it be on TV. Obviously not in the crowd, but I think there's 50,000 in the crowd. So it wasn't as great as, it wasn't as brutal, I should say. I felt that Ben won this fight. I thought he got a little bit robbed. Probably robbed's the wrong word. I'd say it was a very close contest. You could have gone either way. I thought Ben won it. It was again. I mean, yeah, I'm with you. We already mentioned it. The first one we felt was better, although I think the size of the second one was bigger. And the interesting thing was as well was that Don King had negotiated contracts, hadn't he? He had negotiated contracts where the winner signed with him, and then ironically it became a draw. And Barry Earn claimed that because it was a draw, it weren't written in the contract. So in actual fact, Eubank became a free agent and ended up signing with. Eubank ended up signing with King, and I think Ben didn't. I think Ben went another route. So it was quite a bittersweet for Barry. He knew he was going to lose both or one of them, and then in the end, neither of them, or one of them, just signed with King. So I think that was a nice trump card for Barry. But yeah, it was probably it was the start as well of that bitter rivalry between the Hearns and the Warrens. And Warren wasn't best pleased with the way he treated King, because I don't know, Warren and King, they had quite a decent relationship from what I've seen from a distance and what I've watched through the years. And obviously Hearn weren't too keen. I don't think many people were. At the end of the day, that Don King, we always slay him. I do anyway, Sean. I'm not a big fan of Don King's, but he did put on some big events in the 90s, so you can't knock him for that.
No, he did put some big events on in the 90s, and from that aspect of him as a promoter, he could talk a glass eye to sleep, couldn't he? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you put him up against any of the promoters today, the older version of Warren, the Eddie Hearns, all these talkers, all these promoters, I still think he would come out on top in terms of, being the mouthpiece for his fighters, because he was a very good mouthpiece. He was just a bit too much of a shit talker at times, and obviously he's got a murky past, which is, something that could even spout into a podcast episode at some point down the line. But he has got a very, very murky past, and for that and the way he handled Tyson throughout his career, I've always really had that sort of disdain against him. So yeah, anyway, moving on. Let's not talk about that slimy motherfucker. Let's talk about what we're talking about today. We're talking about a fantastic fight, and we're moving on then in Ben's career. 2 unanimous decisions in a row, defending his WBC title against Henry Wharton. Juan Carlos Gimenez beats them both, which then sets up this huge fight with Gerald McClellan, and he was the underdog. The biggest aspect of this fight going into it was the fact that Nigel Benn was written off by everybody. He was written off the way Buster Douglas was written off against Tyson. Nobody thought Nigel Benn was going to go in there and have any chance of beating this knockout artist, this guy with a high percentage ratio. I think it was something ridiculous, like between 85 and 90% knockout ratio on his record. It was, it was unbelievable, the sort of record he was carrying going into this particular fight. And for me, if you look back on that fight at the time, it was all sort of swaying in the direction of a Gerald McClellan win in this particular fight. Let's go into the build-up now. Let's talk about the build-up for the fight between Nigel Benn and Gerald McClellan. What a build-up as well. It
was highly anticipated, wasn't it? I mean, they build it again. The sudden impact. Not to touch on Don King again, but Don King, Frank Warren, they promote the fight. They're good buddies, them two. So it was interesting. I mean, obviously 2 weeks prior, from what I've read and seen, Gerald McClellan came out to England, and it was 2 weeks in England, and he was having a bit of a turbulent time. by the sounds of it, it was in a bit of disarray from what we've heard from Emmanuel Stewart. He pitted up at the Peacock Gym. If people don't know, the Peacock Gym, a very established gym in England. So he was there for a couple of weeks. It was, it went to the point where, from what I'm hearing and reading, he's strapping he's doing his own straps on his hands, and it was a bit of a mess and he was calling the shots, as you mentioned earlier, Sean. He seemed to be the man, was telling them what to do. So, at the end of the day, this guy was one of the best. I mean, people, if they didn't know, 1995, this was, the pound for pound was around at the time. You're talking, probably the pound for pound number one was Roy Jones Jr. Saying that, Pernell Whitaker was also on the scene, and then you had Gerald McClellan. Those were the best three pound for pound fighters in the world at that time. And he was dubbed as the mini Mike Tyson by Don King. And everybody, and I mean everybody, expected McClellan to just blast Ben out in at least, a round to 3 rounds. He was on a 14-fight win streak, knocked out 10 of them in the first round, 10 in the first round. I mean, in 14 fights. And some of them were no mugs, as we mentioned, we've been through his career already. So it was his first fight at super-middleweight as well. So this guy was no mug. And Ben basically jumps on it and he's saying, look, I'm here, I'm going to fight this guy. I don't care what power he brings, I'm going to match it. And that's exactly what he did. And it was just, it had an aura about it in terms of just the moment that Ben walked out. But, we're going to fight in a minute. But I remember the fight itself. I don't remember anything about Gerald McClellan. As I say, I didn't know of the guy. It wasn't until the fight happened that my brother mentioned that, look, bruv, this guy, he's tough. So I was like, oh shit, so Ben's going to get beaten. And he was like, no. So for me, I was like, oh, this is interesting now. As a young lad, 95, I was in my teens, but it was just great. The feeling and just that moment, Ben coming out. So for me, it was I really got myself involved in the build-up and obviously it didn't disappoint, but I don't know about you, Sean, but this was just, even just watching back to the goosebumps now.
You've never been past 8 rounds?
No, I will never go past 8 rounds again. My fights don't go that long. I mean, the way I train and the way I punch, and the heart I got, and the mind I have, my fights probably will never go past 2 or 3 rounds.
Unlike a lot of fighters, though, Ben is never afraid to go in with anybody. He's been in with Iron Barkley. I mean, that was a tremendous 1-round fight that he won. He may be a little bit tougher than some of the opponents you've met.
Well, believe it or not, Barkley was a hard puncher, but you got to have speed and power to make a great punch. Barkley punches was very hard. You can see him coming. The punches that knock you out is the ones you don't see coming. So I have the speed and power. And you can't compare me now with the other fights I had before, because I was like killing myself to make weight. And people said I don't have no stamina. I mean, if you lose 11 pounds the day before the fight, and you'd be exhausted too. So this is the first fight that I'm in the ring with all my strength. I'll be weighing like 175, my natural walk-around weight, without losing any weight, and this is as strong as I ever be in a fight.
You got a tremendous left hook. You got some tremendous range of punches. How long do you think this fight will go?
Well, it depends on Ben. If he sit there and challenge me, then it'll be over quick. But if he take his time and try to outbox me and move a little bit, then it'll probably take me a little longer to catch up with him, but not too many rounds.
What do you think of his punching power?
Well, I mean, he has about 85-90% knockout ratio. He's punching pretty good. I never gave my opponent enough credit. I never give none of my opponents credit for being a big knockout artist, because mentally, if you go in the ring thinking, this guy's a big puncher, this guy's a better boxer than me, mentally you beat. So I look at all my opponents as sparring partner.
What are your strengths, do you think?
Boxing, punching, I can do it all.
Are there any weaknesses there?
No, just me.
Yeah, I've got to be honest. For people who have not watched this fight before, and this is the first time you're listening to it, wherever you're listening to this podcast from, whether it be UK, USA, Australia, wherever you've been listening to us from, this is a fight that if you haven't seen it, that it is an absolutely back and forth, up and down. Any cliche saying you want to use for a fight, this is one of them fights to do it for, because it pretty much had everything you wanted from a fight. It was an amazing contest between the two men, and obviously the build up to it was very important, because you talked about the whole Manny Stewart situation, losing Manny Stewart and then getting Stan Johnson, who, let's be honest, nobody had a clue who this guy was. This guy would walk around with his sort of captain's cap on constantly, even when he was on the body bag and he had Gerald McClellan punching him. He had the hat on, and there was one bit in some of the footage of McClellan actually sparring down at the Peacock when he was on the body bag. You can see him knock his hat off, and at one point he actually cracked him that hard. He knocked Johnson's teeth out, and it was something Johnson went on to talk about in the documentary, which we'll talk about a little bit later down the line. But he was the guy calling the shots. He was the Mr. Big Shot. He was very confident that he was going to go in there and do a number, and it came across in the interviews. There was one point in the most famous sort of interview I'd say McClellan conducted, when he was being asked about his chances and asked how he was going to go in there and beat Nigel Benn. And then there was one point where the interviewer had said, you're ranked number 2 pound for pound best in the world, and his response was, well, who's number 1? So he was the guy that wanted to be number 1. He's the one who's seen himself as number 1. But I tell you what, Nigel Benn, very, very, there was a lot of emotion from Nigel Benn in the lead up to this one, because the British press in particular had given him no chance at all. Now, it happens today. Our British press, unfortunately, for some reason, don't always want to get behind our fighters and usually find a way of kind of making it out like they're already lost before they've stepped between the ropes, and this was very much what it was like. And obviously there wasn't as many regulations and rulings around in 1995 that didn't allow the press to or restrict the press to sort of say what they want, and back then they could say what the hell they wanted and get away with it, and that's kind of how it was. And Nigel Benn was very venomous in what he was saying. You could tell he was really agitated by the British press, and the press completely writing him off in interviews leading up to this particular fight. And he had a bee in his bonnet and a chip on his shoulder, and he was, I think he took that into the fight with him. I think emotion wise he definitely took that into the fight with him. And you talked about it earlier about how he was, he was a limited fighter. Let's be honest, he was a limited fighter. I loved Nigel Benn. I loved watching his fights, but the reason I loved watching his fights was because he literally neglected his jab. He hardly ever threw a jab. It was always sort of hooks and windmill punches. It was just, he'd come charging in, ducking his head below waist height and just sort of weaving in and just throwing hooks over the top. And that's what people was excited about, because you knew he could hurt people when he hit them, but then you also knew he could be hurt himself as well, and he'd proved that in the past. So it was exciting to watch, and he was being wrote off even though he was the WBC champion, and this was his 7th defence as well. And yet the British press and other press were going, no, Gerald McClellan's going to knock you out. He's got an 85% knockout ratio on his record. He's coming in there to do a number on you.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you mentioned, as I've already alluded to, with Benn's technique. I mean, even Kevin Sanders, who was his trainer at the time, said he couldn't jab great. His feet were all wrong. But what he did have was he had heart and he had determination, and that's the only thing you could never fault with Ben. You couldn't. I mean, me and you have grown up watching Ben in some of his biggest fights, and what was it about him? It was just the fact he was so unorthodox, and just you didn't know what to expect from him. But one thing you always knew is he's going to give it 110%.
I'm ready. I don't care whatever he wants to throw at me. I will match him. I'm very confident. I never usually predict a round, but like I said, between 6 and 8.
And I think that's why people felt that all the experts from the moment that if anyone when you do watch the fight, there's the ITV version where it goes straight to Barry McGuigan, and straight away, literally within the first 5 minutes, they're writing him off. I can see his lasted 2-3 rounds.
This is one of the most eagerly anticipated fights on both sides of the Atlantic for many, many years. It's going to be absolutely dynamite when it lasts. Nigel Benn is a tremendous puncher, and he's always in there with a chance. But I went to see McClellan work out in the Peacock gym, and he just looks awesome. And no matter what way I've taken this fight apart and dissect it and put it back together again, I only see one winner, and unfortunately I don't think it's going to be Nigel Benn. He thrives on the occasion. He said no fear is written on his hat, and he really thrives on a night like this where he's expected to lose. Loves to be the dark horse, and there's no doubt he's got a tremendous punch, and he's in there with a chance. This fight will be over in 3 rounds.
And that was the pressure that Ben was under. And as you said, he went in with that on his back. And the crowd had an expectation that actually this guy is tough, this Gerald McClellan. And if Ben wins, this is going to be unbelievable. And to have that 10,000 who was in the stadium at the time, literally all of them cheering on Ben. And that gave him a lift. You could clearly see it. I mean, 10,000 English fans literally cheering him on. And it helped. It was like the extra man, like on a football field, if you like. But absolutely, it was, everyone wrote him off, as you clearly said. And it was just a matter of if he's going to have enough to survive. And rightly so. I mean, Gerald McClellan, he was the pound probably number 2. As you say, he's like, who's number 1? You could put Pernell Whitaker or you could put Jones Jr. in there. So that's how highly regarded he was. And rightly so, he was knocking guys out for fun. But it really did give you an anticipation. As I say, I mean, as a kid, I remember watching it and my brother giving me the old, well, I don't know if he's going to win this. And I remember feeling like, oh, wow, so this is going to be a good one there. And I remember feeling the anxiety. So, as a young fan at the time of Ben's and just boxing, I couldn't wait. And I was just anticipating it, and they sold it to me. And I was a youngster, but it was just great. I could really feel the buzz for this fight, and the fact that Ben was down straight away, he was the underdog.
Yeah, exactly. And McClellan was quite interesting, as I said earlier, in the build-up to this particular fight. Being interviewed in the build-up for it, he's quoted as saying, "I get a greater buzz from a knockout than I do from sex. Getting the power on, watching an opponent fall, there isn't any other experience to compare with it." And this is the type of man that he was. Now, I wasn't sure whether we should discuss the subject of it or not, but I think we should do, because I think people will want to discuss the situations outside of the ring as well. Now, that was a particular statement for him in the lead up to this particular fight, but there were a lot of people at the time that had been hearing reports of what he was doing. Now, there was a lot of press photos where they were taking of him with his 2 pit bulls and how he talked about pit bulls, and he had this sort of love for pit bull dogs because of how aggressive they are, and he compared them to him as a fighter. And then there was obviously a lot of stories. I can't sit here and say all them stories are true or not, but there's a lot of stories of him obviously being involved in dogfighting. And one particular story that stands out in mind is the one where apparently you got a Labrador taped its mouth up and let his dog basically just have a complete go at it and basically kill it. And that was a horrid story to talk about, and it is one that was kind of confirmed by his sister Lisa years down the line when they did the documentary. And obviously they was asked about this particular story, and she kind of sort of said it was maybe a little bit exaggerated, the story, but she isn't going to deny that parts of the story were true. So this is something that kind of left a little bit of a bad taste in people's mouths about it. And even to this day, as horrible as what happened to McClellan after the fight, and obviously we'll touch on that in more detail later, people still have the mixed opinions about him. You've got to feel sorry for what happened to him. You have to, no matter what. No matter what he'd done outside of the ring, what he'd done in the ring, was an amazing achievement. And then to put his life on the line like he did and nearly lose his life and have these life-changing injuries, you've got to kind of understand that aspect of it. But it kind of made people kind of not like him a little bit because of that. And not just a little bit, there was people that really hated the guy. There was people that probably, I hate to say this, but probably wish this type of stuff upon him, what happened to him, because of that the dog situation. And I know it's something we've discussed off air, but I think it's something that has to be touched on. I think we can't ignore the fact that this did happen outside of the ring, and this happened, during the early 90s, and this happened, while he was, a boxer and a fighter, and I don't agree with it. I don't condone it. I think it was disgusting, but, everybody obviously makes mistakes, and some people believe that what happened to McClellan was kind of, I hate to say it, but some people do say it was karma for him. But again, it's a very difficult subject for me to touch on, because I don't want to feel like, we're condoning what he actually did, because I'm not. But I do feel like we have to touch on it, because it was a widely reported story at the time.
Oh, absolutely, mate. I'm not going to lie. I mentioned to you off of air that he wasn't one of my favourites outside the ring. The more I've read about him, the more I've looked into him as a personality. I didn't like him. I'm not going to lie. And the dog situation, the dog fighting. I'm an animal fan, and I like dogs. I like all animals. So for me, I'm not anyone that's involved in dog fighting. I think that's just wrong, and I'm just not going to lie for it. Definitely not the sort of thing I'm into. And obviously the story that Stan Johnson came out with, whether it was true or not, maybe it was fabricated. I mean, the guy's a bit of a loony bin, isn't he? Let's be honest. He probably has made it out to be a lot worse than it was. Makes him sound, a lot worse than probably he was. But albeit, he obviously had a bit of a big head. He wanted to manage himself. He wanted a load of yes men around him. So, you can't not neglect the fact that people didn't like him. He was ruthless in the ring, just as ruthless as he was outside the ring. By the sounds of it, we don't know the guy. This is only what we're being told. So I'm with you. He was a nice fella. I wasn't his biggest fan from when I heard about it. And as you mentioned, maybe it is a karma thing. It's a horrible thing to say, really, because you wouldn't wish this upon anybody, even your worst enemy. So, God, it's the last thing you would want. But yeah, I don't think he was very much of a nice fella outside the ring, basically. So, yeah.
Yeah, there was, like I say, a lot of reports, a lot of speculation, a lot of theories. We'll never really know the truth about it. But I think it's, again, and I stress the point, we have to touch on it because it's part of our job as reporters. We report on information that was given at the time. And, this is something we can't not go throughout the episode and completely neglect these things actually taking place outside of the ring. So, yeah, we've touched on that point now. We've dotted that off. Let's talk about the fight itself. Let's cover the fight itself now, because as you alluded to a little bit earlier on in the conversation, you were talking about the atmosphere, the New London Arena. The atmosphere there is as good as any atmosphere you'll have ever seen throughout history. And if you think it was loud watching it, and you go back and watch it after listening to this episode, and you hear what the atmosphere was like, God knows what it was like inside the arena at the time. And I would love to have been there for that atmosphere alone, never mind the fight, because the atmosphere is sometimes what makes the events and the night so historic. And I think the atmosphere was obviously amazing for this, because Ben was the underdog, and although he was the underdog, everybody was in his corner. Everybody, he had like like you say in football, the 12th man. He had everybody behind him. When he came out and the chimes of Big Ben came up on the sound system, even watching it back, even as recent as today, recording the episode, it gives me these sort of goosebumps and goose pimples, and I'm like, wow, that atmosphere, it just sends sort of shivers down your spine to sort of hear how much of a reaction Nigel Benn was getting going into the biggest fight of his life.
Magnificent reception for the champion. Like Tyson and the haggler, Ben says he's never judged anybody. He's promised to be the old dark destroyer tonight. At 31, he knows there aren't many nights like this ahead of him if he loses.
It is epic, mate. I mean, I do have vague memories. I don't recall it completely of watching it live, but watching it back, my God, just hearing them chants and then like the Big Ben chants and then hearing those 10,300 spectators in the London Arena, which is, the Isle of Dogs, which is my neck of the woods. It's Millwall, it's my football team. So hopefully we don't lose some viewers there, Sean, with that me admitting that. But it was just brilliant. It does send goosebumps all around my body, and just having those 10,000 fans cheering Ben all the way as well. Obviously we are from Britain, we're going to cheer on our Britain boys. You don't want to neglect the fact that Gerald McClellan was a fantastic fighter. He was deadly in the ring, but we're going to back our boys, and we did that night. And normally we talk about the Eubank fights, talk about the Watson fights with Ben, but the one thing you do see with all three of them fellas, even Collins as well when he was around, that when they were up against the Americans or whoever, with Mexicans, we backed them all the way, and we still do today. Don't get me wrong. That had that was just an electric atmosphere. It was almost like the Hatton Costas type of atmosphere, wasn't it? It was just outstanding. And just to watch it back it just brings back those memories. There's little sparks of memories, and it's set up nicely. As you say, as we've both mentioned, complete underdog as well, walking in that ring, expected to be blasted out in a couple of rounds. You could almost feel the anxiety in the air as you're watching it on television. So it was just nice to sit up for this fight.
And let's talk about the first round. My word, what a first round that was. Absolutely unbelievable start to the fight. Obviously McClellan was going to come in there and try and continue his impressive run of first round knockouts, and that is exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to make this an early night. He straight away went at Ben, throwing punches, calculated punches. Ben obviously is trying to duck and weave and bob and weave and move around. He's trying to get out of the way of them. But within 35 seconds of the opening bell, he's got Ben trapped on the ropes. Ben sort of ducking down, weaving, trying to get away. McClellan's throwing the punches down to the back of his head. He's throwing the punches down to the side and the back of his head. And eventually, Ben takes that many punches, he sort of just sags back and falls through the ropes and onto the apron, nearly ending up on the commentator's table. You can see the commentator's trying to kind of keep him from falling onto the table.
He's letting him punch. He's in trouble. He's out down the ring. Seconds into the fight, he's through the ropes. Nigel Benn is down. The count is 6, 7, 8. Can he make it back? He gets in at 9. Oh, what an incredible start. McClellan wants to come right back at Ben. He says, "Get out of my way," to the referee. A right hand by McClellan. Ben continues to be in dire trouble. Can he survive this first round?
Unbelievable start to the first round. And you're thinking, well, everybody's right. Everybody in the press are right here. He's going to get destroyed. And he's out on the ring apron within 35 seconds.
It was just an immense start from Gerald McClellan. And everybody, as they mentioned, you're thinking, oh, God, they're all bang on here. Ben's just going to literally fold over in the first 30 seconds of this fight. I mean, as their punches are coming in, and they're not quite connected, and you're thinking, oh, maybe he's all right. And then there was one right hand that clearly he sort of just makes him go a bit stiff as he falls through them ropes. And obviously, the French referee, who didn't speak a word of English, starts his can. There are some discussions whether actually he probably should have been counted out with those first 10 seconds. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but the one on the documentary, was it something Morris, I think, off the top of my head, from the British Box Border Control. He was saying that if Ben actually come off of the canvas and actually went on the floor, he would actually be given 20 seconds to get back into the ring, which he didn't. So the referee counts. And I watched this the other night, and from the moment that Ben's ass touches that canvas to the point he steps back into the ring, literally 1 foot into the ring, I count 10 seconds. The referee counted 8, so it wasn't quite. It was borderline. That fight could have been stopped there and then. But what a start to this fight it was.
It could have been stopped there and then. It's quite a controversial moment, and as you talked about the documentary years later, which again we'll touch on later, that referee at the time said he had his own way of counting. He had his certain way of doing it. Now this is controversial because obviously this has come up quite recently with the Tyson Fury Deontay Wilder fight, which happened happened when Tyson Fury went down like a sack of shit, and obviously the referee started his count, and he said he got to the count of 8, and Tyson Fury started to get up, and he was on his feet by 9. However, there were people theorising that as soon as his arse hit the floor, like you say with Nigel Benn, they'd counted it on like a timer, but it doesn't work like that. And we have to remind people that actually doesn't work. The referee is the one that makes the count. The timekeeper is there to tell the referee and to signal to the referee when the time starts, but it's the referee that ultimately makes the count. So if he did give him a slow count, he got to the count of 8, and he managed to get himself back in the ring. But the referee was very vocal about that in that documentary, about how he did the count, and he even did the count on his fingers again whilst they're playing the video sort of side by side or fading in and out of the actual knockdown. But the British Boxing Board of Control, obviously steward in charge at the time, as you were saying, he would only get 20 seconds if he would have went off the canvas. Because he landed on the canvas, he was only going to get 10. So it is controversial, and obviously the McClellan camp, Stan Johnson in particular, he's like, no, this is definitely, it should have been fucking over in that first round, and that was that, and it should have been over. And I think you could tell at that point, when you look over to McClellan in the corner, the neutral corner, McClellan thinks it's over. McClellan thinks, that's it, I'm done and dusted. He's sort of ready to celebrate, and then obviously, Benn manages to get himself back in and then continue to take a pummeling. And what was again interesting about it is that referee let that fight go on, and some referees would have stopped that. When you look back on it, some referees would have stopped it on the second assault. When Benn is covering up trying to get his legs back under him, and McClellan's coming in throwing every sort of shot he can. He's trying to work the body, he's trying to throw shots on the inside, he tries to throw an uppercut on the inside, and Ben's somehow managing to sort of grab on and spoil, but there was times where you think to yourself, he's not throwing back here, and actually I think another referee might have stopped that.
On another night, a referee would have stopped that fight, and even Kevin Sanders, who was in Ben's corner, he openly turned around and said that they got away with one, and he probably feels that if he was in the other corner, he would have been calling for that to be stopped, because exactly as we mentioned, barely just borderline 10 seconds, whether you want to call it over or not, we don't know. He steps into that ring, as you say, referees can't, not a timer, so it's never a timer, so it's a referee's count. Sometimes it will be a little bit over, it might be a little bit under. But either way, just after that, McClellan just pounded him. Ben didn't throw much back, and it could have been stopped there again. So they really did get away with one. He soaked it up, he survived well, he held on for dear life, and he managed to get to that second round.
The second round, I think, was much of the same, to be honest with you. Apart from Nigel Benn managed to get through with a few decent shots in that second round. I think McClellan was obviously still ruthless, though, and he was still really trying to put Nigel Benn away. But I think the biggest takeaway from the whole fight, and something that was talked about on numerous occasions, and something you spoke about already in the episode, is how much of a heart, Nigel Benn had. The guy was able to keep himself in there. He was able to keep himself relevant in the fight. He'd throw the odd sort of right hand through the middle, right hand over the top, and it'd catch McClellan. But let's be honest, McClellan, although he was a fantastic fighter himself, his defence really wasn't on point that night as well.
No, it wasn't. I mean, he was looking to get rid of him early, and that was that was the tactics. That was what he employed for a long time, for 14 of his fights, 10 of them he was just blasting them out in a round. So that was what he was looking to do. He had done it against some, I suppose you could say, better fighters in terms of, was Julian Jackson just as good as a Ben? It's possible. You think about it. I mean, we put Ben and Eubank, we're talking about Ben here, but we put Ben up in this pedestal because we enjoy it and we knew he'd always be brave. But in actual fact, he was probably putting away fellas just as good as Ben. So although it was a different weight, Ben had already been a middleweight. He put an extra pound. So, I think his idea was to go in there and just blast him out. But I do believe Ben, although again it was pretty much the same way, for me his punch resistance was a lot stronger in the second round, and he actually finished the round landing a left hook to the body. He was mixing it up as well, but he was kind of under a lot of pressure from McClellan, obviously looking to get rid of him early. But it was again, that determination, that heart, that spirit, you just can't knock it. And although it was McClellan round again, won a 10-8 round. So in the end, he eventually, he survived the second. Many felt this was going to end in the second or the third. So he's got his point now. He's looking for the long haul, and that was what Ben was thinking at the time.
Yeah, it certainly was. And I think that the next couple of rounds, third and fourth in particular, were where I started to see, Ben had weathered the storm of the first two rounds, and then he started to get these shots through, these wild shots that I was talking about. The way he just sort of put his head down, weave underneath. And you got to remember, Gerald McClellan at the time, he was a bigger guy in terms of his frame. He was a 6-foot guy against a 5'9" guy, so he had the physical advantages to make that fight easier for him. But because of, like we say, the way he came in, the tactics he adopted for that fight, he left himself open on numerous occasions, and obviously Ben would capitalise on that. One of these sort of popping right hands over the top would get through, and it'd stop McClellan in his tracks. But then he would come back for more, and he'd take punishment as well. But then Ben would take punishment, and it was a crazy first sort of 3 or 4 rounds of the fight where you think it's all over in the first round after that knockdown through the ropes, and to see Ben perform out of his skin, probably Ben's best performance by far of his whole career, this particular fight, the way he was able to get over that first couple of rounds and get himself through towards the midway point of the fight, and then start to get through and start to sort of take control of the fight, for me was something to behold watching back on it again, because you don't really think about it like in perspective of Nigel Benn. We love him because of his all action style, but like I said earlier, he neglected the most basic weapon a fighter has in the ring, which is his jab. And I don't even remember actually seeing him throw a jab in the fight, if I'm being honest. He might have done, but I don't actually remember seeing it, because all I was sort of engrossed in was the fact that every time they came together, it was a case of who's going to get the better of who, and more so than often in the fight, it ended up being Ben. He ended up getting through. So them third and fourth rounds were very much the sort of same trend that had been set in the first two, but Nigel Benn had started to get through a little bit more, and it was the fifth round for me which was the turning point, the significant round of the fight. Let's just take a quick pause of the episode for just a moment to give a shout out for the sponsors. It's Bear Attack Boxing, providing you high quality boxing equipment, products, gloves, wraps, pads, the lot. Go over and check them out at bearattackboxing.co.uk. On social media at Attack Boxing on Twitter and Bear Attack Boxing on Facebook and Instagram. And as part of being a loyal listener to BTR Boxing Podcast, we've got a discount code in association with Bear Attack Boxing. For anybody that's looking to purchase any of the high quality equipment, you can get 10% off at the checkout by entering the code BTR10. That's BTR10. If you enter that code, you will get 10% off your high quality boxing goods and equipment, and you will be able to go to the gym, saving a little bit of money, but getting that exercise in there, getting on that heavy bag, getting yourself on them pads. Go over and check them out, because they do genuinely give some great products on their website. One shout out is for Rob Hughes, recently purchased some of the Bear Attack boxing gloves and wraps and has spoke nothing but high of their equipment and of them as a company, so please go and check them out. Rob is a loyal listener to the podcast, and he was really happy with the products, so happy that he was inclined to give us a message at BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter and let us know all about it. So if Rob's telling us they're great, we're telling you they're great. They're great. So go over and check them out. It's at Attack Boxing on Twitter, Bear Attack Boxing on Facebook and Instagram, and the website is www.bearattackboxing.co.uk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the third and fourth, it was a fast pace again for those rounds. I mean, watching back on it, obviously in hindsight, is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Because we now know what happened. But that was the point when I did start to notice, the slight evidence with McClellan and signs of distress was he just had his mouth was just wide open. Now, I mean, obviously this is only the fourth round, so it's difficult to assess. How can you sort of work out whether he's in any sort of crisis whatsoever? It's difficult. I mean, he hadn't been this far since 1993, but it's just funny how that fourth round is when I started to really notice that the mouth starting to open, and obviously the struggle for oxygen. No one mentioned it. It's just we now know what happened. So I was always looking for it. Probably not a good thing, really. But yeah, moving into that fifth. I mean, it's pretty much the same as the fourth. With McClellan sort of landing the harder single shots, but Ben was tireless in his work, wasn't he? One thing that he did was he just doesn't stop coming. As you say, he never throws a jab. I don't think Ben, in this whole fight, throws a jab. It's literally left hooks, right hooks, uppercuts. That's basically all, with his head down, and then just hoping that eventually he's going to catch him with one. One thing I did notice was McClellan, he switched his stance to southpaw, to just trying to confuse Ben. And literally, as he did, Ben goes and lands a big left hook, bang on the button. So, and you could see McClellan's cheek was starting to swell towards the end of the round, and he was clearly feeling the pace that Ben was putting on him and the pressure he was putting him under. And again, as I mentioned in the fourth, the mouth opening, this is when the gum shield starts to hang halfway out the mouth as well. So again, it's a signal where there's something not quite right with his breathing. You know, I don't want to go too much away from the fact this was a good fight, but these are certain things we're going to notice. And that he's you know, they don't know him well enough. They're the yes people, I suppose. And, you know, they didn't even notice these other things. Saying that, neither did anybody in the commentary or in the corner, all the doctors that were there. But, yeah, a much better round, that fifth round. It's a good round, and Ben was showing signs that he's going to come back.
Well, you talk about that point of the gum shield, and that was very significant watching back for me. That was the first thing I noticed watching back, and knowing what had happened to him, and knowing the position he ended up in as a result of this fight. Watching back and seeing him start to sort of hang the gum shield out of his mouth, it was like he was either trying to get air or he had some sort of pain that he weren't telling his corner about. It was like, you know, at times it looked like he was sort of biting down on it. He was sort of putting it half out of his mouth and biting down on the gum shield. And I noticed that, you know, in them early rounds, and I was thinking, how did nobody pick up on this? How did nobody actually pick up on the fact that that is not normal practice for a fighter in the middle of a fight? Do you know what I mean? That is not something you see anybody do. I've got to admit, Reg Gutteridge on the ITV commentary did talk about it on a couple of occasions throughout the sort of fifth and sixth rounds. He was mentioning that his gum shield keeps coming out, but no one really there was nothing on that. There was just the commentator pointing it out, but you didn't see anyone in his corner, you know, saying, well, why are you spitting your gum shield out? Why is your gum shield hanging out of your mouth? Well, what's going on? Are you okay? There was none of that at all. It was just a case of, is that the norm? And then it even made me, looking back on it, think to myself, actually, has he done this before in any of his other fights? And then I go back and look at the stuff. He never did it. He never did it. So that, for me, was the early warning signs that he was in a little bit of distress at this point. And what level of distress, we'll never know. We'll never know what level of distress he was on this point. But I think that, for me personally, looking back, that was the early signs that something wasn't going right. Something wasn't right. Whether it was the lack of oxygen, or whether it was, you know, he took a lot of shots, even at this point of the fight, that he'd hurt. He was hurt somewhere. Or, you know, on his head, he might have caught one of the shots that really had hurt him, and it was like biting down on the gum shield, essentially trying to like deal with the pain. It's a way of managing the pain. That could have been the case, or it could have just been the oxygen thing. I don't know, but that's what you start to think about when you watch back on this fight. You start to look at it and think, how the hell did nobody in his corner look at it and go, you know, something's not quite right here?
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you. I mean, I suppose it's easy for us because we know what happens, but you're right. I didn't even think about that, Sean. That's a great, that's actually a good point, because he could have just been a broken jaw. But, you know, there's obviously something not right. And as you say, you know, he's not like he's just a novice. He's had 10 fights. Talk about a guy that's had, like, you know, he's knocking on, what is it, he's 20 odd fights near on. Is it mid-20 fights? I haven't got it at hand, so I've just put the paper away. But, you know, that just shows you, in terms of his corner, that they didn't notice it, you know. And as you rightly mentioned, the commentator, Reg, even says, you know, that he hadn't noticed it before in other fights. And it's clear to see, you know, when you've watched those other preview videos of his other fights, he never did. Saying that, he didn't go to round 5, apart from the Julian Jackson fight, but he didn't get put under pressure like Ben was putting him under. So, I don't know, it's difficult, because we look at it now, and we obviously now know what happens. You're gonna look at these things. But, I mean, with the gum shield moving into round 6, for instance, I mean, the gum shield is literally hanging out of his mouth, and then towards the end of that 6th round, Ben lands an almighty right hand, then that gum shield goes flying out of his mouth. He catches him with a massive right hand. So again, Ben's in his head, he's thinking, you know, I've got him. I needed to take him as far as I can, and from that point, I can take over this fight. And that was the position he was heading towards. And you know, I mean, even I don't know. It's just an odd one, isn't it? Really. I mean, you would pick up. I think if we're watching boxing now today, and we see a guy that doesn't normally have his gum shield hanging out, a doctor would probably just call him over and say, let's have a quick look at him, which they didn't do. So I suppose it's just, you know, this is this type of fight that has helped us progress to make boxing safe, I suppose. But yeah, that 6th round, I mean, that gum shield goes flying out, and then the 7th round again is another punishing round.
It is, and I think from this point onwards, it's just sheer punishment, isn't it? Up until the end of the fight, you know, there's punishment from both sides. Obviously, McClellan's still well in the fight and sort of up on a couple of people's scorecards at this point. You know, the punditry teams were sort of saying he's just about ahead, Ben's just catching up, and you know, this is where Ben's starting to sort of take over the fight, and you know, Ben's starting to land the cleaner shots. The work rate is phenomenal. He, like I said earlier, he performed out of his skin in this fight. This was the best performance of Nigel Benn's career, hands down. This beats the Eubank fights in terms of boxing out of his skin, out of his own ability, out of his own comfort zone. This was one of them fights that, you know, probably left for various reasons, it left a piece of his soul in the ring. You know, people say that about fighters, you know, they left a piece of them in the ring, and I think that night, for obviously more than one reason, he left a piece of himself in that ring, because it was such a grueling fight for both men. And you know, the 7th and 8th rounds, again, it's all of the same. I can't sit here and do a play-by-play for you, because you might as well have just watched the last few rounds, because that is exactly how 7 and 8 go down, and 7 and 8 go down exactly the same. Significant shots landed from both men, and we get to a point where I can't remember if it was the 7th or the 8th, but there was one point where McClellan catches Ben with an absolute peach of a shot, and Ben just sags back into the ropes, and then he goes again, and he goes to throw a left hook. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on this, I can't remember if it was the 7th or the 8th. There's a point where he sags back. It's the 8th. So he sags back onto the ropes, and then he sort of gets him to the corner. Ben's trying to fight his way out of the corner, but as he's doing that, he's ready to go. You can see him ready to go, and he throws this swinging left hook, completely misses, and goes, you know, straight down, sort of to his knees, and then that's when we get that standing count. So then that's when you start to think the tide's turning again, and McClellan's turning the fight around.
Ben showing a stern chin, misses with the wild left. He's trying to end it on one punch. McClellan with a hard right, followed by a left. Ben's in trouble. He's staggered against the rope. McClellan now working the body and the head. A relentless attack. Back comes Nigel Benn out of nowhere. A right hand by McClellan.
That referee is close to stopping this.
Ben buckled over. A right hand by McClellan. Less than 30 seconds of the round. Down goes Ben.
Ben is in horrible shape. And there's too much time to go. Too much time to go. Here comes McClellan. Here comes the charge of the Light Brigade.
Toe-to-toe in the center. Here's Ben again looking. McClellan.
From somewhere, Ben got up enough energy to throw 2 power punches. And that saves him from being stopped here. Because at least he's here. He's fighting.
Yeah, I mean, it was a funny knockdown, because he was in blatantly, you know, he was in a bit of distress, Ben. That 7th, you know, in that 8th round, sorry, when you know, he's caught him with that shot. There's a shot just before, I think it was a right hand where he did throw him back into that corner, and then he unloaded on him. He escaped momentarily, and obviously, as you say, he sort of leant forward, didn't he? It was a weird one. He sort of leant forward, and when you watch it sort of like without the replay, it doesn't even look, it looks like he just falls into the ropes. You sort of thinking, how's he counting him? But in actual fact, it was a little right hand he just caught as well on the top of the head, and you know, the referee rightly counted him, and he took the knee, and you're thinking, oh, this is it now. I mean, I vaguely remember the fight myself, and I remember thinking, this is it now. He's had it, and you know, I thought he's going to get done now, but again, he just showed that heart and that desire, and as you've mentioned already, I mean, this is Ben's best performance. It's not doubt that this is unreal from what Ben was putting in, just the effort. And do you know what? One thing I did notice, which I didn't notice when I was watching the fight, and I actually noticed it the other day, is when McClellan comes in to try and finish off Ben after taking that standing 8 count, Ben manages to throw this almighty right hand, literally as McClellan's walking in, and it literally rocks him to his boots. You can see it, and they both sort of just fall in to a hold. And it effectively just gives Ben enough time to recover. In actual fact, probably McClellan as well. But it was a tough round for Ben, and you're thinking it's all over. But if it weren't for that right hand from Ben, then and as you mentioned as well, like McClellan and Ben, neither of them are looking to defend at any point. If he'd have come with his hands up and just got his distances right, he probably could have got rid of Ben. But he didn't. He lands this right hook, and it is just a great shot. And it just buys him enough time to go into that 9th round.
Well, the 9th round is where most people believe the significant change in the fight happened, because, again, I'm not play-by-play in the round completely, but for me, the most significant part of the round is obviously the accidental headbutt which happened during the round. So obviously, we both, exchanging punches at this point. Ben sort of leans forward to go in for a shot, and then obviously ends up sort of stumbling forward rather than and then actually going in, probably through sort of pure exhaustion and balance, and he lands straight into the sort of, I think it's the right hand side of McClellan's forehead, and there's like a big clash of heads.
Again, a lunging left, no problem for McClellan. Overhand right to the back of McClellan's head against Ben. Again, Ben getting away with it. Rabbit punching. Oh, more talk. Being warned about that from the referee. He punched and then he slipped. Nigel Benn.
And he hit him in the eye. Nigel got hit in the eye. Look at that. Butted on the way down. Oh boy, here we go.
So McClellan will have time. The referee says, get up. He says, let's continue. McClellan went down to one knee, and now, here we go.
But when you watch it in normal play, at normal speed, it doesn't look like it sort of hits him that hard. But then when they slow it down, it's a full-on thump from the top of Ben's head straight into the forehead of Gerald McClellan, and that's where a lot of people, professionals, are arguably saying that this was the point that caused the trauma that ended up giving him the blood clot on his brain, which is what ended up making him suffer with all the long-term disabilities as a result. But significantly, once he got hit with that headbutt, most notably and most striking about this was that he started to back off a little bit more in that 9th round. He was backing off, and he was blinking a lot, and he was blinking a hell of a lot. Now, this is something where people were saying, there's something not right here. There's something not right. I mean, even, again, commentators on both Showtime and both ITV who were covering the fight mentioned that he was blinking a lot. Now, people say, when you're getting hit and you're getting hurt and you're in a fight, you're blinking a lot. No, not as much as that. Not as much as that. I mean, history prior to this fight will tell you that, because you've seen the 15-round grueling fights, like the Thriller in Manila, like the Rumble in the Jungle. You never seen any of these guys, Ali, Foreman, Frazier's, blinking. So you knew for a fact there was something not right here. And again, as we were talking about earlier, about the corner, about what they should have been noticing, how, for me, did they not notice there was a significant change? Especially coming back to the corner and he's pulling his facial expressions, which are, like wincing in pain. And hindsight is they say it's a wonderful thing, but it's also a horrible thing to look back on, because this was really hard to watch, if I'm being totally honest, regardless of what people may have thought about him with their interpretations of what this guy was like outside of the ring. To watch that back again and to see the way he was clearly affected and in pain was hard to watch for me, because at the end of the day, these guys go in there to they fight for their lives, they entertain, they fight to make a better living for themselves, and this was hard to watch for me. Knowing what had happened afterwards was made it more difficult, I think, because you're thinking to yourself, why are the corner just not noticing this? Why are they not pulling him out? How can they not know he's clearly in pain at this point? But yeah, Johnston, that for me, that 9th round was obviously, the beginning of the end, isn't it?
Yeah, it really was. As you say, I mean, it was intentional headbutt from Ben, which didn't look, again, it was only on the action replays that we actually could see that he actually does catch him. But, he's blinking ferociously, isn't he, McClellan? And he takes that knee. The crowd boo, and Azara actually waves him on and tells him, get to your feet, get back in the action type of thing. So, but then from that point, it goes back to the corner. And, even Emmanuel Stewart, he's still, he weren't too keen on participating in his interview and speaking about his fight, but he actually said that, he felt that this tragedy wouldn't have happened if he was in the corner. I mean, again, in hindsight, it was easy for him to say, but there was no doubt that he needed that experience in the corner, because when he did go back to that corner in round 9, obviously we all know what happened. But, Stan Johnson, I think he's just shouting at him, saying to him, "You've got to fight." And, in his head, it's just, he's got no he doesn't even think about his health. There is nothing there. There's nothing. I'm not blaming Stan Johnson. I mean, that's the question, inevitably, isn't it? Is who are you blaming? Are we going to blame his corner? Are we going to blame the referee for picking up on it? We're going to blame the fact that the doctors didn't pick up on the fact that he's blinking. As you clearly said yourself as you watch this fight, it's almost hard to watch, because even when watching these fights, and even in the past, you don't see that. If a fighter does something that is completely uncharacteristic to what you've seen in previous fights, you're going to have a look at it. And if you know your man well enough, and this is where it stems from the fact that how important it is to have a decent corner and somebody that understands you as a fighter as well as a person, they're the ones that can straight away spot anything that's not quite right. And clearly there wasn't something right, and they should have picked up on it, and they didn't. So again, in hindsight, it's easy for us to say. But I mean, moving into the last one, when he eventually comes out, he's jabbing, he's working well behind the jab, McClellan. So he's almost got his marbles about him in a way, because he's actually fighting quite clever from the start of that round. But then he starts touching his eye, and you're sort of thinking, he almost like touching his eye as if just like there's a bleed, and obviously there's no blood. So obviously, I mean, I think I've heard before someone mention like a washing machine feeling he had around his brain. So obviously those were the times. What he was going through in that 10th round. Ben obviously lands some right hooks again, which he was throwing all night, and McClellan takes a knee, gets back onto his feet on the 6th count, and then they sort of come in close. I think he's trying to hold on to Ben, and then Ben lands a couple of uppercuts, and then eventually he goes out and takes his knee, and the referee counts him out.
Round number 10 for the WBC Super Middleweight Championship. Just an incredible night. Nigel Benn hoping that he got a second win between rounds. A left hand by McClellan. McClellan now with a burst of energy dancing around, flicking the left.
The only way he can lose this, well, he can lose it many ways, but one of the ways is to get very cautious and not fight 10, 11, and 12. That's 3 rounds. You can't give it away. You got to fight.
A very confident Gerald McClellan. Ben just looking to hang on.
He shouldn't get that confident. He should not get confident.
Right hand by Ben, just as you say that. And McClellan goes down to one knee. It's a knockdown.
He better get up.
He gets up at 7.
Now that is the strangest knockdown I've seen.
It came out of nowhere. Everybody on their feet, 11,000 strong. Exhorting Ben.
That's what we're talking about, what he can't afford to do.
He goes down again.
What's hurting him? Something is hurting him.
Gerald McClellan.
I don't know. His side, head, something. He's not going to get up. It doesn't look like.
It's over. Nigel Benn has won.
I can't believe that. I've never seen a guy quit in a corner like that. What was that? I can't believe that. Just when we said he can't afford to get confident, he did.
One of the most
Something's happened.
Bizarre endings to a fight in one of the most compelling fight nights you'll ever see.
Yeah, and I think the biggest controversy about the ending to the fight was, I think, both commentators for the USA, for Showtime, and obviously Reg Gutteridge and Jim Watt in particular, were talking about him quitting, and that was something that would come back to haunt them a lot. Obviously, as the years would go by, sort of being called out on these comments that they made at the time. Now, I'll be honest, listening back to the commentary at the time, they were not to know what condition he was in and that he had a bleed on the brain. They didn't know that. They might have had an indication he was hurt because of that headbutt had an effect on him. They must have kind of known that, being, you know, in the industry and knowing the sport themselves. They must have had some sort of inclination he was hurt. But I don't think they would have known what was to come after that. So the fact that they said he quit was kind of how they felt at the time. They felt, you know, he didn't have the heart. They felt he didn't have the same desire as Ben had shown in the fight. And I can understand why both Showtime commentators and the British commentators mentioned the fact that it looks like he'd quit the fight. I understand that now, looking back on it. At the time, obviously it's a completely different story, because at the time you're in the emotion of the moment, the adrenaline's pumping, and it looks like McClellan's just had enough, and that's it, he's calling it a day. But clearly the man was in a lot of pain. There was something very wrong going on in his skull and his brain, and nobody knew it at all. So it's quite a sad sort of state of affairs at this point, because as you say, Ben has won. You know, he's loving it, he's running around the ring, he doesn't know what's going on obviously with McClellan at the time, because obviously this was a big thing for him. This was a massive win for him. Nobody said he was going to do it, nobody thought he was going to do it, and you know, it was pure adrenaline and emotion from Nigel Benn at this point. But then obviously we start to see the effects of what was happening to McClellan in the other corner. He goes from sort of being, you know, walked over to the corner, and then you get back to him on camera and he's sort of sat in the corner on the floor, sort of slumped, and then the next time they come back to him, he's lay on the floor. And then, you know, this is where everybody knows evidently there's something not quite right going on here. I think looking back on things now, and obviously the safety of what we have in this day and age, the biggest sort of gripe and the biggest frustration for me looking at the fight, and I know it's all past and I know it's all history, but when you look at the fight at the time and you look at the aftermath of it, you look at it and you think, why the fuck are this many people in the ring when this guy is on the floor clearly needing medical attention urgently, and yet there's still too many people in that ring? And obviously this is, like you said earlier, you said this kind of, it paved the way for obviously what was going to happen in the future in terms of better regulations, better health and safety aspects of fights. Unfortunately, this was one of them fights that sort of set a precedent where they knew they needed to make things better as a result of this. But when watching it back again, I felt really frustrated watching it, because I felt like, you know, what's going on here? Why are they letting this many people still stay in the ring when there's clearly, you know, 3 or 4 doctors there trying to attend to McClellan, who's now on the floor lying down unconscious? It was hard. It was really hard to watch, because, you know, you feel really frustrated. You feel like you just want to go and jump into the screen and say, just get the fuck out of the ring, this guy needs help. And that's how it made me feel. Again, the impact of the aftermath of this fight still, you know, I can't imagine how it affected the McClellan family. I really can't. But even just watching it back now, you know, in 2019, for me it still really hits home. It really does.
Oh, it does, doesn't it? It's really hard to watch. You know, although it was, we're always going to allude to, you know, this has come up as a legendary night because people voted for it because they thought it was a good fight. I think, you know, it had everything, really. I mean, it literally had everything to fight. And you know, I think in terms of what happened with Eubank Watson, I think mistakes were rectified following that fight, their rematch. But obviously there was still clearly a lot to learn. I mean, the medical team, for instance, they had 4 doctors, 3 of which were trained for resuscitation. They had 2 sets of paramedics. They had 2 ambulances on hand on the site. So basically, you know, everybody was, in terms of, you know, a health situation, you know, there wasn't even, I don't think there was even an ambulance in the Eubank Watson fight, which is crazy, isn't it? You think about it now. But, so there was a lot done by Frank Warren to make sure that these fighters were safe in a way. But I think for me, I think as you said, the fact that it's just all these people in the ring, Clennon's on the floor, unconsciously, clearly needs oxygen, got all these people around him. You know, one thing you told, you need to give this, you got to give them air. I suppose the first thing is as well is that, you know, fighters, they will celebrate once they've won a fight, but then they will automatically sort of, after a little while, a corner or someone will give them a nudge and say to them, all right, you don't celebrate, just go over and touch gloves with him, you know, make sure he's all right, and just say, you know, good fight, and then you go and celebrate again, type of thing. And the other thing was the post-fight interviews. You know, they had the guy in the ring, he stood on the floor. You know, and they're showing you the post-fight interview. They're literally on Ben straight away, having a chat with him, talking to him about the fight, which is something that you wouldn't see again today. You know, today they wait, and then they will decide whether, then they will decide actually he's okay, and then they'll ask the corner, and then someone will come in and do the interview. So it takes a little bit longer. Whereas then back in the day, they were literally just on you. And I suppose again, the other thing is the commentators are a little bit less hasty to use that word quit. For one, I think they'll wait for a fighter to be in a stable condition, and then maybe give it sort of 15, 20 minutes. And then when they sort of mention their post-fight, they discuss the fight, that's when they might mention what they actually believe. So, you know, there were aspects to change, and I think, as you say, it was weird. I mean, you're talking, it's only 24 years ago. It's not long ago. I mean, we remember it clearly. So it's funny, isn't it, how there is still so much that went on that night that sort of makes you cringe. But again, you know, these are things that have helped us in the progression. Doesn't help the McClellan family. You know, they're still going for it today. But it really was frustrating to watch for itself.
One person I want to say hello to back in America is Roy Jones. He's a top boy. If I'm going to class myself as the best super middleweight in the world, I've got to be Roy Jones. And Roy Jones, glad, I'm very happy for you beating the mouth, James Toney.
What do you think happened when he quit in such a apparently not hurt kind of a situation? What was that?
He was hurt. He sustained a lot of punching power to the head.
Did the butt do anything to him? Did you butt heads?
No.
Come on, we're in the middle of something.
No. You predicted what win. So this is my time now. Okay. My time. And the thing about it, you know, it wasn't actually to do with the headbutt. He just couldn't sustain the pressure. All them 2 rounds and all that don't mean nothing. It's when you go in the later rounds, that's when you find out.
But were you shocked to see him go down on a knee and stay there?
I'm glad I was going to finish him there and then.
But you thought, what's he going down for?
No, I didn't think he was going down. He sustained a lot of punching power all through the rounds.
But Nigel, there wasn't one clear shot to put him down. I mean, the TV shows you missed twice and the guy goes down.
Yeah. But so what? He put me down twice. But that's when it proves that, you know, I've got a heart. And everyone's writing me off.
Don, right now there's a guy laying on a stretcher over there.
Don't keep me.
Wait. Let me, Nigel, don't leave a minute. The guy's laying on a stretcher over there. If it was ruled for a foul, then the whole thing is up in the air. You don't know who the champion is.
No, I don't think so. I think that I don't know what the ruling is going to be, but all I can say is that Nigel Benn proved to the world today he got a lot of hearts, a lot of Keonis. He fought his behind off. He was outside the ring, got back in, got knocked down twice. He rose to the occasion, got to give him his just due.
Well, you deserve to have the last laugh, so I'm giving you the last laugh. Tell it. Tell it.
Thanks a lot, Freddie. I think it's one person I think I need to fight to class myself as the best in the world is Roy Jones. I know Roy Jones is different class, but to me, to class myself the best in the world, I think I would have to fight Roy Jones. But at the moment,
let's unify the other WBA title, and then you got 2 and Roy has 1, and then we go for Roy. Just like
Let's touch on the aftermath then, Johnson. You've obviously alluded to the facts just a little bit, but the aftermath of it, for me, the whole fight is more significant than any other fight we've covered for Legendary Nights, really, because of obviously how it affected McClellan and his family, as you was touching on there. Obviously, this was, you know, life-changing for the McClellan family, for McClellan himself. It was hard. It was hard for them, you know, as a result of this now, as a result of these injuries that he suffered, you know, he ended up suffering a massive blood clot to the brain, and he had to undergo a 3.5 hour emergency procedure to remove the clot. The surgery saved his life, but he was in the coma for 2 months, and he ended up blind, hearing impaired, brain damaged and unable to walk, his short-term memory severely limited, and his long-term memory selective. So it had done complete damage to him. You know, he was very, very lucky to make it out of this alive and to some capacity. And, you know, it was really, really sad to see what had happened to him. And, you know, what was good to see was some fighters, and in particular, someone who was touted to be a rival, Roy Jones Jr., actually did a lot of charity fundraisers for him in the aftermath of this over the years, and he was probably one of the ones that mainly did something for him. Obviously, we're going to come on to Nigel Benn now, and obviously that aftermath, this affected him massively. He was never the same after this. You know, he was in the sport for another 2 years, had fights with Collins, lost to Collins, and, you know, that really sort of was the sort of the aftermath of his career, really. But for me, it's the stuff that happened afterwards with McClellan, which has made a huge impact on the sport and a huge impact on his life. And it was really, really sad. And they did the documentary, didn't they, ITV, and they basically got the footage of them coming together for the first time in 12 years. And the way they put the documentary together, it's called The Fight of Their Lives. For anyone that wants to watch it, it is on YouTube. You can catch it on there. So if anybody that listens to the episode has not watched this documentary before, go and watch the fight first, watch the build-up, watch the fight, then watch this documentary. And I can guarantee by the end of the documentary, if you're not sort of welling up or even crying by the end of it, then you're not human. You've got no emotion, because I watched that documentary. I watched this documentary about recently, and I know you did. And there were points of the documentary that I found really difficult to watch and really hit home. And to see how emotional the reunion between Nigel Benn and Gerald McClellan was really hard. I felt like, even though this event, the meeting again for the first time, happened in 2007, it felt really hard for me to watch. And I'm just thinking, oh, fucking hell, I can see how hard this really did hit Nigel Benn as well on the aftermath of it. And you hear the story of Nigel Benn throughout his career, and the life of the drugs, and the life of depression, and the fact that he attempted suicide at one point in his life, and then he became a born again Christian and changed his life and turned it around. And you look at Lisa McClellan and some of the stuff she was talking about. She's talking about wanting Ben dead, like a lot of people were saying. There was a particular article that came out in one of the newspapers saying, we want Ben dead, kind of thing. And I thought that was hard. And I can't imagine how Nigel must have felt knowing that people were saying this in the press. And you just can't even bear to imagine how it affected him. And it did. Like I said, he wasn't the same again after that. And it was hard. I don't know about you. I don't know how you felt. I know you've watched it back a couple of times in preparation for this episode, but for me personally, I really, really struggled to sort of kind of keep it together, to be honest with you. And these are events that have long since passed, and I honestly, I felt really sort of emotional watching it, because I felt like this happens to people, and what happens to them people afterwards? They just get left behind and never spoken about again, or never get the support they need, or they end up like in really bad times. And for me, it was sort of hard to watch, because I know the McClellan family, still to this day, still struggle, because Gerald McClellan still needs this care that costs about 70 grand a year.
Yeah, exactly. And it was tough. I mean, I think Ben walked away with I think it was 750,000. I think, and McClellan got, but apparently what Warren and Don King have said is that they give extra money on top, which probably accumulated to about $500,000 that went to the McClellan family for hospital bills, etc. I mean, this is just what we're being told. Who knows? I mean, it was very tragic what happened. I think coming from Lisa McClellan as well, I think from her perspective, I think the press didn't make it easy, because obviously Ben also went to hospital and got himself checked over, and I think he come out and I think he said something along the lines of it wasn't me, or something like that. It didn't come across very well. No, we know, back then things could be edited very easily. I'm not saying he didn't say what he said. It was very sort of, he brushed it off. It was just a fight, and he's in hospital, I'm not, type of thing. And it didn't come across well. It didn't come across well at all. And obviously, the news were reporting on it. You got to remember as well, this is 95 as well. It's 24 years ago. It's not that long ago. I mean, for me, it seems quite recent. I remember Euro 96 like the other day. So for me, it's not that long ago. And people were screaming out to abolish boxing. This is the situation that boxing was in. It was already under difficult pressures with back in the 60s, and then you had Davey Moore's death as well in a featherweight title fight against Sugar Ramos. So this was live on television, and even then the hate campaign started with The Sun, and I can't stand that newspaper, and I'm sure there's plenty of people that can't either. But you got McClellan in hospital, hanging between life and death situation, and you get The Sun, who has a chat with Ben, and they they jump on the old Ben Eubank and started Ben's World War IV by targeting it, by making it, because obviously, he was in the army in his early days, before he became a boxer, or as he started out as a boxer. So it was just bad taste. The whole thing really badly done. And don't get me wrong, we watch it back now and everybody can see it, and you're like, oh God. And even Ben will turn around and say, there's things he said. And then thankfully years later they did meet up and they done the I can't think what it was now. It was like some sort of charity event, and they raised like £500,000 for McClellan or whatever it was. Or I'm probably getting that figure, I know where it is. But it was nice to see him and Lisa sort of build a bridge and come to an understanding, because it was a tough night. And obviously Stan Johnson as well. If anyone go and watch this, what Sean just mentioned, the documentary, because Stan Johnson's the absolute Fruit Loop. You believe what you want out of what he says. I think he's an absolute moron, me personally, and I think he makes things out to be a lot worse than they are. But it was just a great fight in terms of just the fight, but what happened after was tragic, and it was literally from ecstasy. God, I can't get my word out now. It's getting late. And agony, and that is basically what it was. It was in a nutshell. This was Ben's career. This fight, great fight, but terrible ending.
Yeah, and that does sum up the fight. And yeah, just touching on the Stan Johnson comments that you made there. Yeah, the guy's a Fruit Loop. The guy is an absolute tool. Every name under the sun you want to call this guy, he's definitely in the same category as Don King, as being deluded as fuck. And yeah, if you watch the documentary The Fight of Their Lives, you will see some of the shit that this guy comes out with. Even to this day, this guy still points the finger at anyone other than him damn self, and that's another part of it that I felt, frustrated watching again. Even though this documentary was made in 2007 and came out in 2011, watching some of the stuff, the comments that he made, you're just thinking to yourself, how can you sleep at night? How can you live with yourself? You could have possibly prevented this from happening, and yet you still sit there and try to point the finger at the referee, and try to point the finger at Ben being on steroids, and all sorts of other shit that he came out with. Yeah, honestly, the guy's a Fruit Loop. But just sort of wrapping it up then, Johnson, as you were saying, ecstasy and then agony, and does sum the fight up and the aftermath in a nutshell, really. And I hope that the difficult subjects that we've had to cover off in the episode, and I hope we've kind of given our objective opinions on them, and I hope I do genuinely hope no one has taken offence to anything we've actually said, because I've wanted to cover this off in as best way as possible, and it's so difficult because it's such a sensitive subject. And obviously since this fight has happened, people have gone on to pass away as a result of injuries sustained in fights. It's happened recently in the UK. Scott Westgarth, just over 12 months ago, lost his life after a fight, and then we had two fighters quite recently who lost their lives as a result of injuries sustained from a fight. So even though the sport is 10 times safer than what it was back in 1995, these incidents can still happen. Sometimes they cannot be detected, these injuries, but this was one fight where, looking back on it, as I've said many a times in the episode, I think it was something that could have been prevented, and unfortunately for the McClellan family, it wasn't, and they've got to live with that. And I think, looking at the interviews and listening to Lisa McClellan in particular, I think they've kind of resigned themselves to the fact that, this is life, and this is what they've got to deal with, and obviously they're giving Gerald the best life that they can possibly give him. And I wanted to wrap it up as well by sort of saying, if anybody out there, wants to sort of donate anything towards the Gerald McClellan Trust, you can go onto the website geraldmcclellan.com, and there is an address you can actually send donations to. And if anybody's got that spare couple of quid knocking about, and I know there's thousands of listeners that listen to our podcast, if a couple of quid and you can send it to them, it'll just help go towards funds for medical fees for him, because in America, as the American listeners will know, they don't have a national health service. They don't have a health service which which provides free healthcare for people. They have to have insurance to pay for their healthcare, like we would if we're putting insurance on our houses for contents or something. They have to have insurance for medical things. So, his costs are like 70 grand a year or something like that, and that's a hell of a lot of money. So I don't even know where they source that money from. I think obviously they get donations from probably local sort of fundraisers, and probably ex-fighters or fighters may still be doing bits here and there. I don't know, but if anybody listening from the UK, the USA, wherever, you want to donate anything to the guy's medical costs, then I think you should do. And personally it's something I'm going to do, regardless of some of the stories that we've spoke about in this episode about the dogfighting and things like that. I take that aside. I'm sure if the guy was fully sound of mind in today's world, I'm pretty sure he probably would regret anything that he's maybe done, and probably we can got to at least give the guy a little bit of forgiveness for that. And I think that's the way you should kind of try to move on in life. And if anybody can go out there and do a bit of donating to him, please do. Anybody that lives in the Freeport area that might pick this up and listen to this episode, anything you can do to help the guy in his medical costs, and you should do it, because at the end of the day, the guy was a former world champion middleweight. He pushed the boundaries and went to super middleweight and tried to go for that greatness, and unfortunately didn't come out on top. And it's sad what happens to some fighters sometimes. They don't, I heard a story yesterday that Kirkland Lang, who fought Roberto Duran and beat Roberto Duran in the 80s, he is living homeless apparently. That's a rumour going around. I don't know if it's true or not, but some fighters don't make it out of the other side of this.
No, they don't. It is a really tragic turn of events, as you mentioned. The trouble he had and what he was involved in outside, we may not disagree with, but at the end of the day, put that to side, it's the family, isn't it? You can't, for what the family are doing for him. I mean, they ain't, they don't make his decisions. He was only 25, 26, in his mid-20s, wasn't he? He was a young lad. He wasn't even, he would look back, as you say, today, he'd be near on, 49, 50, the fella, so if not a bit older. So, he still is obviously still here today, but I mean, if he had all of his faculties, I think he probably would be a little bit, even Ben, again, I mean, he was no angel, Jesus, he done some terrible things, and obviously, as you mentioned too, he actually tried to commit suicide, which is crazy. I didn't even know that, actually. I did actually watch that documentary, and I forgot about that, which is terrible, really. But these guys go through some horrible stuff in their lives, and they do go in the ring to perform, and sometimes they don't come out as they went in, whether that be in a box or in the situation that people like Watson and McClellan are in. I mean, it's tragic. It really is terrible. But, on the other side, I mean, McClellan, you can't forget how much of a great fighter he was, and Ben. McClellan, I mean, people still say to that Roy Jones Jr. when McClellan turned pro, he was like, I ain't going near this kid. So this is just to prove that if he was around for the next 5 years, who knows what he could have gone on to achieve, because it could have been one of the best, because he was that good, he was that strong and that powerful. But a great fight, and just awful how it all ended. But great to cover, Sean. I mean, as you rightly said, sometimes these fighters, it just doesn't end up the way we expect it to, especially when all of our sort of millions and thousands are watching on TVs or going to these events. You just assume that they're going to come out all rosy at the other end, but it doesn't quite work out like that sometimes. And this is a fight where it didn't. So yeah, go and just give some money to the fund. I mean, that would be a great help, and I think deserved for the family.
Yeah, 100%. I can't echo that enough for people that have got the opportunity to do it. Go and do it, because I'm sure the McClellan family would really appreciate it. And we've got to remember, obviously, all the good things that he achieved in the sport, and obviously what he was trying to go on to achieve in the sport as well, and the horrible aftermath and the life-changing injuries that it left him with as a result of partaking in the sport. So I think that about wraps up this episode of Legendary Nights. And as always, if you have enjoyed this episode, please let us know by telling us on social media, on Twitter at BTR Boxing Pod, and on Facebook at BTR Boxing Podcast. Let us know what you think of the episode. Let us know what you think of the subjects. Did you enjoy it? Did you struggle to listen to it? Was there anything you felt like maybe we got a little bit wrong? Please let us know. We're open to feedback. We're open to hearing what your thoughts are on this particular episode. And in the same sense, if you felt it was a fantastic episode and we really covered this off and did it justice, please also let us know as well. If you have been rating and reviewing, we really appreciate it. I've noticed a few more reviews coming in, and I've noticed that we've got reviews coming in from the USA Apple Podcast Store now, so we really appreciate the guys that have been going on and rating and reviewing us separately on there. If you are a USA listener, go on there and rate and review us, because we really appreciate it. It really helps us get more exposure for the podcast and all the hours of work we put into it. And if you're not on Apple Podcasts, please go and check us out on Podbean or Stitcher, Spreaker, Player FM, Spotify, Castbox, even YouTube, Eat, Sleep, Boxing, Repeat. You can find the podcast episodes on there as well. So this is it. This has been the tale of Nigel Benn versus Gerald McClellan. It was one of the greatest fights, one of the most fights that give you the most ecstasy and most agonising moments at the same time. Johnston, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. And listeners, we'll see you next time.
And right now, Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history